Pacific Ocean, night. Early 1942 that the harbor is barely awake that a thin mist clings to the water, blurring the outlines of steel hulls tied to the pier. Diesel fumes hang in the air. Somewhere, a bell rings once, sharp and hollow that a young American sailor stands alone at the edge of the dock, sea bag at his feet. He is out of breath. Too late. The ship he was assigned to has already pulled away, its stern fading into darkness, screws churning the black water without hesitation. Orders were orders. The war did not wait. Around him, other destroyers idle. Their decks are dimly lit, silhouettes of gun barrels cutting into the night sky. This sailor was supposed to be elsewhere, on a different deck, under a different commanding officer, following a different chain of events already set in motion. Instead, a clerical delay, a misheard order, a few minutes lost in the chaos of a wartime port have placed him here. Within hours, these same waters will erupt in fire. Torpedoes will run blind through the dark. Crews will fight by instinct, not sight. And 4 Japanese destroyers, veterans of night warfare, will be sent to the bottom of the sea, not because of a carefully laid plan, but because one young sailor was not where history expected him to be. And as the engines begin to turn again, chance quietly takes its seat on the bridge. It'd be why early 1942, the Pacific War had settled into a dangerous rhythm. The initial shock of Pearl Harbor still echoed across American naval doctrine, while Japanese confidence, built on speed, coordination, and night fighting skill, remained unbroken. The Imperial Japanese Navy had not merely struck first. It had struck with precision, preparation, and a clear understanding of how modern naval warfare could be decided before dawn. That Japan's destroyer force was the sharp edge of that doctrine. Long before the first bombs fell on Oahu, Japanese naval planners had invested heavily in night combat. Their destroyer crews trained relentlessly in low-visibility maneuvering. Their officers memorized silhouettes, wake patterns, and the subtle differences in engine noise carried over open water. Most importantly, they possessed a weapon unmatched by any other navy in the world, the Type 93 oxygen-fueled torpedo, known later to the Allies as the Long Lance. The Type 93 could travel farther, faster, and with a heavier warhead than any American equivalent. Fired in darkness, it left no telltale wake. A Japanese destroyer could launch an attack from beyond visual range, turn away, and never be seen. Entire Allied formations had already been crippled this way in the opening months of the war. The United States Navy, by contrast, was still adapting. American destroyers were well-built, their crews disciplined, but doctrine lagged behind reality. Radar, still new, still misunderstood, was installed on some ships, but often poorly integrated into command decisions. Gunnery officers trusted their eyes more than their screens. Communication between ships was rigid, formal, and slow. Night actions were considered dangerous anomalies rather than deliberate opportunities. This imbalance would shape the fighting across the Solomon Islands and the narrow waters that surrounded them. By mid-1942, these island chains had become the front line of the Pacific War. Guadalcanal, Tulagi, Savo Island, names that would soon be etched into naval history, formed a choke point where supply routes, airfields, and sea lanes converged. Control of these waters meant control of momentum. The Japanese called their nighttime resupply missions the Tokyo Express. Under cover of darkness, destroyers raced down narrow channels to deliver troops, ammunition, and food to embattled garrisons. They relied on speed and night superiority to avoid American air power. For the U.S. Navy, stopping these runs became an urgent priority. Destroyers were no longer escorts. They were hunters. Both sides pushed their ships into confined waters where radar returns bounced unpredictably off islands and shorelines. Engagements began suddenly and ended violently. There was little room for retreat. A wrong turn could place a ship directly in an enemy torpedo spread. It was into this environment that a young American sailor was deployed, trained, disciplined, and anonymous among thousands. He was not a strategist. He held no command authority. His role was small, procedural, almost invisible. But in modern naval warfare, invisibility did not mean insignificance. As task forces assembled in forward ports, schedules tightened. Ships rotated crews, replenished ammunition, and departed on short notice. Orders were shouted over engines. Men ran gangways in the dark. Rosters were updated in pencil, not ink. And in this compressed, high-pressure system, even a minor disruption could ripple outward, quietly altering positions, assignments, and outcomes long before the first shot was fired. The stage was set, the ships were moving, and somewhere between dock and deck, history had already begun to shift. The waters north of Guadalcanal were never meant to host decisive battles. They were narrow, cluttered with islands, reefs, and unlit shorelines that swallowed sound and distorted distance. At night, the sea there did not open, it closed. Every course change felt closer than it was. Every shadow hinted at danger. By August and September 1942, these waters had become a killing ground. The United States Navy, determined to deny Japanese reinforcement routes, began deploying mixed destroyer and cruiser forces to intercept nighttime supply runs. These missions were defensive in purpose, but offensive in execution. Ships were sent into darkness with incomplete intelligence, uneven radar coverage, and orders that left little room for hesitation. One such operation was forming under urgent circumstances. Japanese destroyer flotillas were scheduled to run supplies southward through the Solomon Chain. Intelligence was fragmented. Reports from coast watchers, aerial sightings at dusk, radio intercepts that suggested movement but not intent. American commanders knew something was coming. They did not know exactly where or when to meet the threat. U.S. destroyers were assembled quickly. Crews rotated between ships as availability shifted. A sailor assigned to one vessel could find himself reassigned hours later due to maintenance delays, staffing gaps, or simple logistical friction. That was how the young sailor missed his ship, his assigned destroyer, part of the planned screening element, cast off earlier than expected. A minor administrative delay kept him ashore just long enough for the lines to be thrown off and the gangway pulled back. There was no dramatic argument, no shouted protest, just a moment of realization as the ship slipped away into the channel. Naval procedure left little room for indecision. He was not sent back to barracks. He was placed aboard the next available destroyer in the task group, a vessel already warming its engines, already committed to the night operation. This destroyer would occupy a different position in the formation, not the forward screen he had trained for, but a flanking element, offset slightly, tasked with independent maneuvering if contact was made. Its commander had broader discretion. Its radar team was experienced. Its torpedo officers were alert, aware that the Japanese favored surprise and massed launches. Across the water, the Imperial Japanese Navy was executing its own plan. 4 Japanese destroyers, fast, modern, and heavily armed, were moving south under cover of darkness. Their mission was routine by 1942 standards: deliver supplies, withdraw before dawn, avoid decisive engagement if possible. Their crews were veterans. They had fought at night before and survived. Japanese commanders expected confusion from the Americans. They assumed hesitation, miscommunication, and delayed reaction, patterns observed repeatedly in earlier clashes. Their confidence was not arrogance. It was experienced as both forces moved toward the same narrow stretch of sea. Radar screens flickered. Bearings shifted. Operators debated contacts that appeared, vanished, and reappeared. One on either side understood how close they already were. And aboard one American destroyer, one that had not originally been meant to carry him, a young sailor took his station. He checked equipment. He followed routine. He did not know that his presence, in this specific place, at this specific hour, would soon align with a sequence of decisions that no planner could have designed. Because when night combat begins, ships do not fight as diagrams. They fight as moments. And the first of those moments was about to arrive. Angle 1. The human angle. Youth in the machinery of war. The sailor was young, not unusual for 1942. The U.S. Navy was filled with men barely out of their teens, trained quickly, and sent forward faster than doctrine could adapt. He understood procedures. He understood hierarchy. What he did not understand, what no sailor could, was how fragile the system around him truly was. Missing his assigned ship did not feel like destiny. It felt like failure, a small, personal mistake in a war already filled with larger ones. There was no sense of relief when he stepped aboard the alternate destroyer. Only the quiet pressure of proving usefulness where he had not expected to be in night actions. Fear was not dramatic. It was contained. Men spoke less. Hands moved automatically. Every sound, every clank of steel, every change in engine pitch carried meaning. The sailor did not see the enemy. He felt proximity instead. A tightening awareness that something unseen was moving nearby, that he was not making decisions. But his presence filled a slot in the ship's operating rhythm. One less hesitation. One more set of trained hands. In modern warfare, redundancy mattered. Systems worked not because of brilliance, but because enough people did exactly what they were trained to do at the exact moment required. And that is how history often moves. Not through heroics, but through absence and replacement. Angle 2. The tactical angle. Destroyers in the dark. Destroyer combat in the Solomon Islands was unforgiving. Engagement ranges collapsed at night. Formations stretched thin to avoid torpedo spreads, yet doing so risked isolation. Commanders balanced aggression with survival, knowing that a single well-placed torpedo could erase a ship in seconds. American destroyers relied increasingly on radar. But radar was not certainty. Early sets provided bearing before range. Contacts overlapped. Shorelines interfered. Tactical decisions were made with partial information and delayed confirmation. Japanese destroyers exploited this uncertainty. They favored long-range torpedo attacks followed by disengagement. Their doctrine assumed the enemy would not detect them in time to respond effectively. What neither side fully anticipated was how a slight change in formation geometry, one ship offset just enough, could create an unexpected firing solution. The destroyer carrying the misplaced sailor was positioned wider than planned. Not exposed, not forward, just different. Its angle relative to the Japanese approach placed it outside the expected axis of contact. That difference mattered. Angle 3, the technological angle, radar, torpedoes, and timing technology did not decide the battle alone. Timing did. American radar detected contacts inconsistently. But on this destroyer, the radar team trusted their instruments enough to report early. The data was imperfect, but it arrived sooner than expected. Japanese torpedoes were unmatched in performance. But they required correct assumptions about enemy positioning. They were fired based on doctrine refined through repetition. That doctrine assumed American ships would behave predictably. They did not account for accidents. The sailor's ship, slightly out of place, altered the geometry of the encounter. Radar reports led to torpedo preparation earlier than planned. Gunnery remained secondary. This would be a torpedo fight, and in the darkness, timing, not intent, was already beginning to decide which side would strike first. Angle 4. The leadership angle. Command without clarity. Command at sea during night engagements was an exercise in restraint. Officers were trained to act decisively, yet punished for acting prematurely. Radar contacts could be false. Visual confirmation was rare. Radio silence was often maintained to avoid detection. The commanding officer of the American destroyer carrying the misplaced sailor faced a familiar dilemma. He had partial radar contact. He had no visual confirmation. And he knew Japanese destroyers favored surprise. Doctrine suggested waiting. Experience suggested otherwise. He chose a narrow path. Prepare without committing. Torpedo crews were readied. Bearings were updated continuously. The ship adjusted course by degrees, not turns, maintaining flexibility without revealing intent. This was not bold leadership. It was disciplined leadership, the kind that rarely receives attention but often determines outcomes. That on the Japanese side, leadership relied on confidence built from past success. Their commanders assumed American hesitation. They expected disorder. They planned their torpedo launch accordingly. What they did not anticipate was a commander willing to trust imperfect information just enough to act first. Angle 5. The enemy angle. Assumptions in motion. Japanese destroyer captains entered the engagement believing they understood the enemy. They had fought American ships before. They knew their weaknesses: poor coordination, delayed reaction, reliance on gunfire over torpedoes. Their formation reflected that belief. They advanced aggressively, confident their first torpedo salvo would shape the encounter. They assumed the Americans would not detect them early enough to counterattack effectively. But assumptions in war are fragile. The offset American destroyer disrupted expected contact patterns. Radar bearings did not match visual silence. The Japanese misjudged the number and placement of enemy ships by the time they realized something was wrong. Torpedoes were already in the water, moving silently, guided not by brilliance, but by alignment. Angle 6. The moral angle. Accident versus intention. War narratives often search for intention. They look for planning, foresight, and deliberate choice. But history rarely cooperates. The sailor did not intend to change the course of a battle. He did not seek advantage through absence. He simply boarded the ship he was told to board. Yet his presence mattered, not because of heroism, but because systems are sensitive to disruption. A single replacement can alter timing. A single delay can change geometry. A single misplacement can create opportunity. The moral discomfort lies here. Victory can emerge from accident as easily as from design. And in the dark waters of the Solomon Islands, that truth was about to surface violently. Measured in seconds, steel, and lives. The night fractured without warning. The IT began not with sound, but with confirmation that a radar contact held steady long enough to be believed. Bearing consistent. Speed unmistakable. Not land. Not illusion. Time compressed. On the American destroyer's bridge, orders were issued in clipped phrases. No speeches. No hesitation. The torpedo officer acknowledged quietly. Gyro spun. Tubes were aligned. The ship adjusted course by a few degrees, just enough to bring the target into a favorable firing arc without silhouetting herself against the horizon. The sailor remained at his station. Hands steady. Training automatic. He did not know the names of the ships approaching. He did not need to. In the dark, identity mattered less than distance. Across the water, the Japanese destroyers advanced in confidence. Their formation was tight, optimized for a coordinated torpedo strike. Lookouts strained against the darkness, eyes trained for muzzle flashes that had not yet appeared. They believed they still owned the night. They did not know they had already been seen at approximately 2,300 hours. The American destroyer reached firing position. The order came without emphasis. Torpedoes away. Steel cylinders slipped into the sea, one after another, their engines igniting beneath the surface. There was no visible wake. No sound carried across the water. Only calculation and momentum. The destroyer turned slightly to open distance, maintaining radar contact but denying the enemy an easy solution. Other American ships were still maneuvering, still sorting bearings. This attack was premature. By doctrine WWII reality, it was exactly on time. Minutes passed. Seconds stretched. Then, in the distance, a sudden bloom of light tore through the darkness. One Japanese destroyer shuddered as a torpedo struck amidships. The explosion was violent, immediate, lifting steel and flame into the air. The ship's forward motion collapsed. Fire spread rapidly through compartments not designed to withstand such force. Confusion rippled through the Japanese formation. Signals were sent. Courses altered. Another destroyer began evasive maneuvers. Too late. A second explosion followed. Closer now. Then another. The American destroyer had not fired wildly. The torpedoes had been launched into a pattern shaped by geometry, not certainty. But in confined waters, patterns did not need perfection. They needed alignment. Japanese crews fought fires and flooding simultaneously. Orders overlapped. Searchlights flickered on, then off, revealing more than they concealed. The night, once protective, now betrayed them. The engagement was no longer theoretical. It was irreversible. And the chain reaction had only begun. The sea did not settle after the first strikes. It convulsed. Japanese destroyers reacted the way disciplined crews always did, by executing doctrine under pressure. Engines went to flank speed. Rudders swung hard. Smoke was laid to obscure silhouettes. But doctrine assumed a single axis of threat. It assumed the enemy would still be organizing. That assumption was now false. The initial explosions had done more than cripple ships. They had shattered coherence. Radar contacts multiplied on American screens as Japanese vessels broke formation, each maneuver creating new vectors of exposure. In the confined waters, evasive turns compressed distances instead of opening them. Another American destroyer, now alerted, now committed, released its own torpedoes. This time the launch was deliberate, coordinated, and informed by the chaos already unfolding ahead. One Japanese destroyer attempted to reverse course, presenting her broadside in a desperate effort to outrun the invisible threat. The torpedo struck beneath the aft mounts. The detonation snapped propulsion, throwing crewmen from their feet and extinguishing what little momentum remained. Fires followed, flooding. The ship slowed, then stopped. Dead in the water, a fourth destroyer tried to escape north, engines screaming, bow lifting as speed increased. It never cleared the envelope. A torpedo detonated forward, tearing open compartments and forcing an immediate abandon ship order. Survivors went into the water as flames climbed the superstructure. The night filled with light, brief, violent, and final. American ships did not pursue recklessly. Commanders understood the danger of counterattack and the presence of unexploded torpedoes still running blind. They maneuvered carefully, guns trained outward, radar teams tracking for any sign of surviving threats. None came. Within a span of minutes, for Japanese destroyers, modern, experienced, and vital to nighttime operations, had been sunk or rendered beyond recovery. The water was littered with debris. Oil burned on the surface. The sounds that followed were not explosions, but shouting, splashing, and the crackle of fire. The silence settled in that felt heavier than the noise before it. Aboard the American destroyer that had fired first, there was no celebration. Damage reports were read, bearings checked, orders acknowledged. The sailor remained at his station, aware only that the tension had eased slightly, replaced by exhaustion and disbelief. He did not yet know the scale of what had happened. He did not know that the engagement would later be studied, dissected, and cited as a turning point in American destroyer doctrine. He only knew that the ship he was never meant to be on was now moving slowly through wreckage, alive, intact, and improbably victorious. The night had taken its toll, and dawn would soon demand accounting. Dawn revealed what darkness had concealed. As the first light crept across the Solomon Sea, the scale of destruction became unmistakable. Charred steel protruded from the water where sleek destroyers had once cut clean wakes through the night. Oil spread across the surface in slow, iridescent sheets. Debris drifted, planks, twisted metal, fragments of equipment still marked with imperial insignia. American ships held position cautiously. Lookouts scanned for survivors and threats alike. The possibility of submarines lingered. So did the memory of Japanese counterattacks launched at first light in earlier battles. But the radar screens remained empty. The night action was over. Reports began moving up the chain of command. 4 Japanese destroyers destroyed or rendered total losses. No American ships sunk. Minimal damage across the U.S. task group. Casualties were limited, astonishingly so, given the violence of the engagement. For American naval commanders, the numbers were difficult to reconcile with precedent. Previous night battles in these waters had often ended in disaster or stalemate. This time, the outcome was decisive and unexpectedly one-sided. After-action reports focused on timing and positioning. The early torpedo launch, the offset destroyer, the advantage gained by radar contact acted upon rather than debated. No single report claimed credit for the victory. Instead, they described a sequence of correct decisions made under uncertainty. The Japanese losses were confirmed through aerial reconnaissance later that day. Wreckage patterns and oil slicks matched reported positions. Signals intelligence intercepted confused transmissions during the night. Evidence of surprise rather than planned withdrawal. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, the blow was sharp and immediate. Destroyers were not expendable assets. They were the backbone of night operations, the carriers of supplies, the guardians of larger vessels. Losing 4 in a single engagement disrupted schedules, strained logistics, and forced a reassessment of risk in waters once considered familiar. Survivors were picked up where possible. Many were not. The sea absorbed the rest without distinction. On the American side, there was no public celebration. The war was too young. The losses elsewhere too heavy. But within operational circles, the engagement circulated quickly, discussed quietly, studied closely. Something had changed. The sailor learned of the outcome secondhand, through fragments of conversation and the subdued tone of officers reviewing logs. He understood only that the ship he boarded by accident had done something extraordinary, not because of brilliance, not because of luck alone, but because in the chaos of war, a system had briefly aligned, and that alignment was about to ripple outward, into doctrine, confidence, and the way the U.S. Navy would fight the night from that moment forward. In the weeks that followed, the engagement was dissected with care. not celebrated loudly, but examined precisely. American naval commanders were cautious about drawing conclusions from a single night's success, yet the implications were impossible to ignore. This was not a victory achieved by superior firepower alone, that it was a victory of adaptation. For the U.S. Navy, the battle validated a quiet shift already underway. Radar, when trusted and acted upon early, could negate Japan's long-held advantage in night combat. Torpedoes, once treated as secondary weapons in American doctrine, had proven decisive when employed aggressively and without hesitation. Formation flexibility, once considered dangerous, had created opportunity instead of vulnerability. Training programs were adjusted. Night fighting exercises intensified. Destroyer commanders were encouraged to act on radar information rather than wait for visual confirmation that might never come. The engagement became a case study, circulated through fleet bulletins and tactical memoranda. Japanese naval leadership reached different conclusions, but with equal urgency. The loss of 4 destroyers in a single action forced a reassessment of risk. Night operations continued, but confidence was shaken. Commanders became more cautious. Routes were altered. Escorts were strengthened. The assumption that American forces would remain hesitant in darkness was no longer reliable. In war, belief is a resource. That resource had been depleted. For the young sailor, the aftermath was quieter and more personal. There were no medals tied directly to his absence from his assigned ship. No citation for being in the wrong place at the right time. His service record reflected routine duty aboard a destroyer engaged in combat operations. Yet his life had diverged from a path that night. The ship he missed would later face its own dangers. Some of its crew would not return. History did not record what might have happened had he been aboard. It only recorded what did happen because he was not. War is filled with such divergences. Unmarked, uncelebrated, but permanent. As operations resumed and the fleet pressed forward, the waters of the Solomon Islands returned to their uneasy rhythm. Ships came and went. Battles followed battles. Losses accumulated on both sides. But beneath the surface of doctrine and dispatches, something fundamental had shifted. The night no longer belonged to one navy alone. And in that realization lay the quiet legacy of a missed ship, a changed formation, and 4 destroyers resting on the ocean floor. War often presents itself as a series of grand designs, maps, and commands. Yet, sometimes it is shaped by absence, by displacement, by the smallest deviations from plan. One young sailor, delayed and misplaced, did not aim to rewrite history. He did not seek glory. He simply existed in a moment where the machinery of war, human decision, and chance converged. The sinking of 4 Japanese destroyers was not inevitable. It was the product of timing, geometry, and the quiet precision of those who acted within uncertainty. It revealed the fragility of assumptions, the limits of doctrine, and the unforeseen consequences of human presence or absence. For history, the engagement underscored an enduring truth. Strategy alone does not guarantee outcomes. Technology alone does not secure victory. In the dark, the smallest variables can determine the scale of destruction, the lives lost or saved, and the course of a campaign. The young sailor's story, accidental though it was, became a lesson in the invisible threads that bind action to consequence. It reminds us that war is not only fought in grand plans but in moments unplanned, in the quiet decisions of those who follow orders, and in the alignment of systems sensitive to disruption. And when the next dawn rises over narrow seas, the echoes of such nights endure, not as legend, but as testimony to the strange, intricate architecture of chance and choice, where absence can become presence, and an ordinary sailor can, unknowingly, alter the tide of history. The sea, calm once more, reflects. The early light, indifferent to the lives it cradles or the steel it swallows. Yet in that reflection lies the story of one night, one sailor, and 4 ships that will never sail again.